Hello everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar Applying AI to ESG Analysis. My name is Matija Ratkovic and I'll have a pleasure of introducing our speaker today, Kayum Rajan. He is the founder and CEO of ESG Analytics and we call him Q. He is passionate about applying AI to environmental, social and governance sectors and supplying investors with unique and simple insights into complex ESG topics. We are excited that he's covering this topic with us. Over to you, Q.
Awesome. Thanks for that introduction, Matija. So nice to meet you, everyone. My name is Kiyum, or Q. A little bit more facial hair than this photo from a while back. But a little background about me. I'm the founder and global head of ESG Analytics. And my previous background was in the financial markets before I got involved in technology. And so I'm a CFA charter holder and really look to apply that to data and other sort of insights. I'm also a data scientist and engineer with an expertise in natural language processing and sentiment analysis. And so really my two worlds are where the data meets the finance stuff, and we'll cover lots of that today. A little background about ESG Analytics. So ESG Analytics is a software platform that allows you to look at company ESG scores using real-time insights. We leverage ESG sentiment and other elements to give you scores that you might not be able to find in other places because of the lack of news and media that we'll talk about more today. So today's presentation is titled Applying AI to ESG Analysis. So what we're going to cover today is why AI is useful in ESG analysis. But to get into more of the meat and bones of this entire topic, we need to understand a few things. So we'll need to understand what is alternative data. What exactly do we mean when we talk about the term AI? Why we need it in the world of the current providers and where they fall short and why this is even more important. And then we'll talk about actually applying AI to ESG and do a few case studies and show you how you can actually use that in your day-to-day practice. Before we get started, we're just going to launch a quick poll to ask about the people in the room. So if that pops up, we're just going to ask you what your role is today. Okay, so it looks like we have quite a diverse mix of people. We have a few portfolio managers, we have some investment analysts, we have some fintech platforms, people building some different software, and quite a few who are other, so likely outside of the financial world, which is great because honestly with the ESG world, it applies so broadly, and we'll talk more about that soon as well. Great, so to get started, what I like to say is that the concept of ESG, or the genie of ESG, is out of the bottle. What do I mean about that? Most of you are here likely because ESG is quite a topical term. And the reason that it's so topical is because it's been making a lot of headlines, right? When you look at the chart on the right, this is talking about the investment flows into ESG vehicles. This is into exchange traded funds, mutual funds, anything to do with sustainability. We've seen a little bit of a drop off this last year. But still, you can see that there's almost like an exponential increase in the amount of investment going into this. On the left side, you see the amount of money that's being spent on data, and this is surpassing this chart, in today's environment. So most of these flows are driven by people embedding ESG into their investment process or compliance process, or lots of different sustainability elements that come into play, like carbon emissions, et cetera, et cetera. So one of the key things is that as investment professionals, as asset managers, pension funds have embedded ESG into their processes, now that it's there and things have started to get more structured and it's become almost a table stakes requirement, it's not really something that's going to stop anytime soon, right? And this is kind of key to understanding where the growth is for ESG. When we look at the way companies disclose ESG things today, we like to say that it's just the tip of the iceberg. And the reason is when you look at where ESG data comes from, today is primarily based on company disclosures. But the thing is, it doesn't work like the financial disclosures. It's not like the 10Qs or 10Ks on a quarterly or annual basis. Typically, what still happens today, unfortunately, is that it's usually a CSR report or a corporate sustainability report that's issued once a year. And this might not be in such a structured format. It is changing, but to actually understand all of the different components of ESG, or even to understand the company's full picture, we need to look at things like alternative data. We'll talk more about alternative data later on in the presentation, but just as a quick sort of snippet, really alternative data is everything that's outside of traditional sources, right? So instead of a company actually disclose their actual disclosed financial or earnings reports, this might be looking at something like social media or other elements that can play a part. One of the things that bugs me a little bit in today's environment is the concept of the term AI. It doesn't bug me so much. It doesn't bug me so much as I see people getting confused with it. And typically it's because it gets used in so many different contexts. We have the era of ChatGPT and other AI algorithms pretty much hitting us, everywhere. But the thing is, like, what actually is AI and what are the subsets of AI? Because we can't just use this blanket term that can be so broad. When we look at the actual term of artificial intelligence, that's a very big umbrella term. And really that's a technique that allows us to mimic human behavior. You might have subsets of AI, such as machine learning, and you might have subsets of each of those things, such as deep learning. I find that this is one of the most helpful charts for understanding the different components of AI. And once you start to look at this, it really does help to put everything into perspective. So you can have things like machine learning or natural language processing, which might include things like machine translation, which is something like Google Translate, right? Or you might have vision applications. If you've ever been on Airbnb or used some sort of ID processing tool, most likely that was a system that used artificial intelligence, but very specifically used vision and image recognition to make that happen. Some of you might be using, Siri or the Google Assistant in your cars or computers. That would be using speech and speech to text and things like that. So lots of big subsets here. And so when we talk about applying AI to ESG, there's lots of different ways that we can do it. We'll go over those as a whole, but primarily we're going to be focusing on natural language processing, which is taking a look at textual data and using computers to understand that in a way that a human could. So we talked a little bit about alternative data, and really good examples of alternative data are things like, web scraping or internet activity, satellite imagery, any kind of data that just might be outside, again, of traditional sources. One of the best uses of alternative data, or one thing that I think helps to highlight, is my story of why we actually started ESG Analytics, and this is during the era of COVID. So in 2020, what was happening was we were having markets go down at like 15% or 20%, just really crazy movements because we didn't know what was happening, right? The world was shutting down and things were going and whipsawing in different ways. And you couldn't really rely on economic statistics like PMI data or economic data or monthly reports of consumer sentiment. You had to sort of act way faster. And one of the things that really caught my eye was the concept of open table data. Some of you who might have booked a restaurant before might have used OpenTable to book that table, and they work globally. And one of the cool things that they did is that they actually started publishing their data on a daily basis to show how much restaurants were open or closed or being booked comparatively to a year ago or a month ago. And you would actually see these big heat maps on a day-to-day basis showing like everything going from like 100% booked to 0% booked. 5% booked. You would see specific states start to go up in volume while others are totally blocked. You'd see entire countries change on this sort of map, and that was daily. And so that kind of data gives you a very, very fresh insight that can actually allow you to move faster and more accurately compared to potentially traditional data. They're best used together, obviously, but it just shows you the power of what you can do when you have this kind of data. These charts here show the spending on alternative data, especially by the big investment firms. And in a survey that was done last year, 78% of investment funds said that they were going to use alternative data as part of their investment selection process. So when we talk about using AI and all of its different subcomponents to ESG data, there's lots of different things that we can talk about, right? First of all, with ESG, we're looking at environmental, social, and governance data. With environmental, there's lots of different things that fall under that E, whether it's carbon emission data or water usage, different things like that. We've seen some very interesting applications of satellite imagery to track carbon emissions, or as an example, for a forestry company, they've been able to actually track the way that those trees are cut or opened up. Under social, you might look at things like country demographics, you might use social sentiment, things like Glassdoor or different ratings and review sites. These are all things that have a very rich amount of data that you can actually use to understand a company's context better. And then with governance, there's things like, again, Glassdoor or being able to monitor executive turnover using LinkedIn data. Honestly, the scope is so wide, but by using these different components, we can use machine vision, machine learning, NLP, speech recognition to derive different signals to be able to make better informed decisions. If you look at the traditional approach to ESG data, and when we say traditional, we are talking about the traditional data supplied by, Moody's, Bloomberg, Refinitiv, extremely important data sets, especially in light of what I mentioned earlier, which is the fact that the ESG data today is not really disclosed in a machine readable or structured way. It is changing, but to date, we've had to rely on individual analysts actually looking at this sort of data out of, a 600-page corporate report and pick out what the water usage was for this company, what were the carbon emissions, what were, the employee turnover, and any of these kind of elements. And so traditionally what happens is each of these teams have really big collections of data analysts in different locations, and they'll go in, they'll process this data when it comes out, which is typically every 6 months to 1 year, and they'll aggregate this raw data coming from the company disclosure and put into an ESG database. And so typically, this is why historically you've seen ESG scores not change very frequently, because they're usually done once a year when that happens. It's also why the data is very expensive, because it's really the static point in time data. And so obviously if you lose access to that, there's a lot of ramifications there. Apart from the speed of data, another reason that we might want to look at AI-based data is because it can be a little bit less biased, right? This is not to say that analysts are biased, but what we're seeing just by proof of the data is that when we have a lot of the different firms using the raw data and using sort of like analyst methodologies to create these scores, we're seeing this thing emerge where the scores are not very correlated across providers. And that really does pose a problem for investment professionals, because if you are, let's say, an analyst looking at Boeing, or if you're somebody in the compliance division looking at a company to use a supplier, and if you go to Asset4, Rebecca Sam, Vijay Iris, Bloomberg, and you look for scores on these companies, and each one says a different score. One is saying good, one is saying bad, one is saying okay or neutral, one might not have data. How are you actually supposed to make a tangible, informed decision without, buying every single data set out there? It's a problem that we've seen causes more confusion, and for that reason, I think it's really worth exploring different approaches to this. The other issue that occurs here as well is because the landscape is focused on using human input to derive these scores, both from the collection and analysis process. What you typically see is that there ends up being a large cap bias to the way the companies are scored. And this is not to say that the other companies are bad, but if you think about it, more muscle is put into doing the ESG analysis for bigger companies, because those are the scores that will get sold to more people. It's the same problem that we have in investment analysis today, where analyst research reports do have a more large cap or mid cap bias, and you'll see many less research reports on small cap or OTC stocks and things like that. That's one side of the large cap bias, but the other thing is also the resource, right? So it does take a lot of energy input monetary value to do this kind of ESG disclosure. It's a whole data landscape of your carbon emissions, tracking your company, your performance, and a small cap company with 10 or 20 people or 30 people, they're not going to have that muscle to build a whole sustainability team and give these scores. And because it's not necessarily regulatory required, there's less of an incentive to do so. So these really do contribute to sort of the lack of ESG data or the small universe that exists. So just to summarize what that looks like before we dive into how we actually do AI-based analysis, is that today the scores are typically based on company analysis that's every 6 to 12 months. There's a little bit less coverage because of the size bias, and we do see some bias in the way that the actual analysis is done. If we're looking at AI-based approaches, which we'll talk about shortly, we can actually change these things at every metric. So we can actually have real-time data because we use an alternative data that exists in the public ecosystem. Because we're now using machines, we can actually take a whole set, some construction outside, it sounds like. We can actually look at an unlimited set of coverage, which can be quite powerful. And it's explainable ESG, meaning we always have the underlying data points to where the scores came from, which is quite different from getting a score, but not knowing who the human was that made that score. This fundamentally changes the way that we look at these scores and ratings. And for many people, I think in the era of ChatGPT, where it seems like everyone, and the doctor is using their friend ChatGPT, you'll be a little bit more familiar with the way this chart looks. So traditionally, we would collect data, use humans to process the data, analyze the data, and then we would generate the scores and ratings. It's very similar to, before when we used to write things or do some coding, we would do some research, we would, create a draft, we would do that, and then we would publish. But now we would maybe use ChatGPT, understand some context, get some ideas, and then use those and make them better. Same thing here with ESG research. Once we use an AI-based approach, what we can do is go in and look at all the data. We can use AI to extract the signals and material things. And then what we can do is use these signals to then review and make an investment decision. Nothing's ever replacing, it's really just enhancing the productivity of what's possible. Okay, so now we can get to some of the good stuff. So what is NLP and how does it work? NLP stands for natural language processing. And that is really talking about making computers being able to understand text and voice. We'll primarily be talking about text today. And as I mentioned, there's lots of different elements of this, like sentiment analysis, information extraction, question answering, which is actually what ChatGPT is, and different things like machine translation, like Google Translate. Some of the data inputs into this are news, media, social. You might have different websites. Pretty much anywhere that you see unstructured text can come in and be an input into NLP. That's why I talk about things like ratings and review sites, right? Or even text messages. These are all things that can actually be taken and used to actually quantify and extract some signals. I find this to be a really helpful diagram of what ESG actually is. And just as I'm saying this, one thing I'll also say is that we do have the ability to answer questions. So if you do have a question in this webinar, feel free to write that down and we'll be happy to answer the questions at the end. So this image has a lot going on, but if we break it down, what we're trying to do is say for a sentence like the pizza is really good here, but the service was slow, what can we use NLP for to actually do some extraction with? And some of the things that come in are things like topics. People might refer to this as topic modeling, but this is where we can actually look at different keywords, we can look at different contexts to say, what is this actually talking about? So in this case, the subject that we're looking at is pizza and service. And so you might actually be able to separate those out and say, hey, this portion of the sentence is talking about pizza, and now this one's talking about the service. Within there, you might be looking at different categories. So we might have, food and drinks, experiences, different elements can come into play. And then we want to look at things like sentiment analysis, where we want to say how good or bad something is. And it gets really interesting when you start to dive into the different approaches to do this categorization or these topic modeling or sentiment analysis and how that actually works. I'll give you an example. When we think about this from an ESG standpoint, we might be looking to understand, is a company, or is the sentence that we found about a company, if we look at something, a headline saying, Boeing has, the 737 MAX crisis, and this is, impact to, a bunch of customers or things like that. We might actually be looking to say, okay, first of all, once we know it's Boeing, we want to understand what is this talking about, right? Is it related to environmental, social, or governance elements? And within there, we might have different categories of the terms involved in, in environment or in social. For me, I'd probably classify this as customer welfare. And in that context, there's two different approaches we can take, and a few more as well. Some might take a dictionary-based approach. And what they might say is that, let's say for the category of environmental, here are all the words that might be involved in the environmental space, right? It might be wastewater, it might be carbon emissions, it might be the weather, these different elements. And when you use a dictionary-based approach, that is a fixed list. So the shortcomings is it might not capture everything, but likely you can do quite a bit of good work right there. Another way of doing this is going to be more of a trained model, which could come from a few different elements, but likely you'll be using a machine learning model. To do that, what you might have instead is have a lot of different sentences, one talking about, let's say, Boeing's carbon emissions for this year, and another one talking about their use of water, or, et cetera, et cetera. And you might actually get machines or humans to label these as different categories. So you might say, this sentence is related to environmental, this one's related to social. You might even subcategorize those. And once you have enough data, you can actually start to train a model to then make that prediction. I've given an easy example here of adjectives. And so on the right side is a representation of a trained model talking about what it would determine to be an important adjective. And the way that would work is, let's say you have a sentence, let's say you have a bank of sentences, and each one might include one of those words on the left. And so each time those things are mentioned, you might label that sentence as having a list of important adjectives. And these are the top 100 adjectives used in the English language. And so once you train that model, you would actually then be able to predict that on new data to understand how, if that's going to be an important adjective or not. So that's one way to do it. The easier way to do it, if you're just starting out, is you might just have a list of 100 adjectives and say, every time we see that in a sentence, when we tokenize a sentence, then we would say, hey, that is an important adjective. So different approaches into how this works. When we're looking at the full data pipeline of applying this to ESG, the way that we look at it is sort of a three-step process. So the first thing you want to do is aggregate all of the different sources you can find. For us, we use different news libraries and APIs to use over 100,000 different sources. That includes news, media, PR. It also includes things like earnings transcripts, ratings and review sites. It can include some social, anything that we can get our hands on that represents unstructured text. So the first thing you want to do is understand what is the relevance to the company at hand. And so you might have a list of companies. What we do is we create a knowledge graph of a company's sort of sphere. So if you think about something like Apple, we might be looking at Apple as a company, Apple's, the brand affiliations, an iPhone, Mac, et cetera, we might be looking at its ticker symbols or its people. And that would be everything that represents Apple as a company. So it could be, there's a simple and hard way to do that. Of course, they come with different complexities and trade-offs. But the first thing we want to do is understand, is this company relevant to this sentence? In some cases, you might actually find some data sources that already do this for you, skipping a step. Once you understand the company's relevancy, what you want to do is understand the ESG classification. And so this is what we talked about earlier when we're looking at dictionary-based approaches or machine learning models. And one of the key questions you might ask is, how do you actually understand what are all the ESG topics, right? There's environmental, there's social, there's governance. Within each of these, there's a million different categories. And the key is to pick one, right? So another issue we didn't mention about with the traditional providers today is that they tend to be, I would say, a bit more of a black box model. So Sustainalytics or MSCI, they have their own ESG classification terminology. Within there, they have their own sort of representation, which also does become a little bit hard to sort of mix and match. We've seen other firms take the approach to just tell the people using the software to say, hey, put in what you think are the keywords for environmental, social, or governance. What we did is we said that SASB, if you're not familiar with it today, is the leader in, I would say, the lead in governance structure for disclosing ESG characteristics. So they will say sustainability, but most companies today, as they get more refined in disclosing ESG data, they will typically do that according to the SASB methodology. We thought that it was better to use something like this versus creating our own new model, especially if this is where companies are going to go. And so within here, SASB has 26 different topics, which I think is a really good start. You could even bin it up a level if you want to keep it a little bit easier. But if you're going to start out, I would say that these 26 topics represent a really, really good framework that captures most of the issues and topics related to sustainability. And so we're always trying to tag a sentence or data related to this. We use both a dictionary-based approach and an AI-based approach. So the dictionary-based approach has over 80,000 words that basically are characterized for each one of these different categories. And on the other side of things, we have two different versions of trained models. One where we take all of these words and understand, based on a Reddit-based model, we'll understand how similar these words are to others in its ecosystem. So if we're looking at environmental, we would put this through our Reddit algorithm to understand, hey, what are other words that are related to this? And this starts to increase that pool of words even more, along with trained sentences that are labeled by humans based on our previous results to say, okay, now that we know these sentences are 100% related to human rights or customer privacy, we can create a trained model to then actually say, you know what, this new sentence that we've heard of, that is categorized as X or Y, and we can give a score. And so these are different approaches to look at that. Just going back to here, once you do that, what you actually have is basically, you have an unstructured text that now you've represented to a specific company. And then you've also categorized that specific text to that company's, to the ESG topic. So at that point, you've sort of done this exercise of taking the needle out of the haystack, because you can actually discard the rest, right? Not every news article, not every text article is talking about ESG, but now you can refine which ones actually are. And the key step into turning that into some sort of a score is sentiment analysis. So sentiment analysis, going back to our NLP example here, is where we want to determine whether something is positive or negative. It can be as easy as that. It can be a 1 or 0 for positive or negative. What we like to do is create a score out of that. And so again, we use a dictionary-based approach and a trained approach to understand, okay, for each of these sentences, how does that score on a scale of -1 to +1? And you can imagine, a sentence like the pizza is really good. That might be closer to a +1, maybe 0.9 or 0.8. And on the other hand, something like, hey, the service was slow, that's going to be something that's going to be more negative, maybe -1 or -0.8. One of the key things is to make sure that whatever you use is a bit more contextual to the topics that you're actually looking at. There are various word lists that you can use to get started. So as an example, in the financial world, there's the Henry word list that includes over 2,000 or 3,000 words scored that are shown to be, very specific to the financial world, right? So things like embezzlement, right? Or beat in earnings. These are things that might be positive or negative, but you might not find those in some of the standard libraries that you might use for NLP, such as Spacey or NLTK if you're using Python. And so once you do that, you'll really be able to, actually quantify this. And so we'll show you a couple of examples of what this actually looks like in real life. So what we're looking at here is the ESG Analytics platform. And this is basically looking at Boeing as a company and all of the different characteristics looking at there. We call our sentiment score the ESG Pulse. That's just our name to give a name of the sentiment. And so what we can see here is that Boeing has a ESG Pulse of negative 0.14. That again is on the scale of negative 1 to +1. And so when you actually do end up doing sentiment analysis, what's really cool is you start to be able to create this time series data that can actually give you a company's trends over time. And again, this is very specific to ESG. And so what we do is the green line here is the day-to-day sentiment analysis or ESG Pulse. And so you can see that this is a little bit more volatile because if we're looking at unstructured text like news and media and PR, typically this is going to be following news cycles or different controversies or media that exists. And so what we like to do is smooth that out with a 30-day moving average, which is the white line. And that will help you to basically understand kind of a bit more of a normalized version of where that company stands. And so you can see that they tend to be stable, but on the lower end of things. Where this becomes useful is from a relative analysis context. So the purple line here is the industry sector that Boeing is in, which is industrials. And you can see that it hovers way below its industrial line, meaning that, compared to other peers, it is performing worse. Once you classify data in different ways, you'll be able to plot charts like this, which allow you to say, okay, for a given company such as Boeing, how does that actually look versus its industry on very specific points? And here you might see that the green line, which is them specifically, versus the orange line, which is their industry, there's going to be places where there's a bit more of a delta, right? So things like employee engagement or access and affordability, customer welfare, customer privacy. These are all elements that can come into play. And this is where you would then use your human intuition to say, okay, let's go in and understand what are the issues with Boeing related to, diversity and inclusion or ecological impacts. And then you can actually go in and do that work. So this AI-based process then saves you that step of really reading, uncovering, understanding all those insights, which is honestly not even humanly possible with the amount of information in the world. The key thing about the AI-based analysis as well is that it's all coming from very specific data, right? So if you're looking for some of the negative things that are happening with Boeing, you're going to be able to actually see very specifically where this data is coming from, right? So you'd be able to actually go into the full text, understand which sentences were tagged for product quality and safety, which ones are tagged for sustainability, and you'd get really to the bottom of all of those components. And so just quickly on the product side of things, so we offer a web platform. You could also use this on an API basis where you could then leverage that as part of an existing workflow. So for people that are trying to go and create different elements such as news feeds or use this as part of a portfolio management process, you could actually go in and get scores on companies on a day-to-day basis and be able to leverage that to understand, okay, how is the company pulse for Agilent technologies happening on a day-to-day basis? And this all can be used to then create charts, create platforms, and build whatever you're choosing to there. So as we start to wrap up here, one thing that I want to talk about is just the different approaches that you can use or the different places that you can use ESG data in the investment process. And given the folks on the phone, it also, on the webinar, it actually goes beyond investment process as well. So typically, ESG data was used for negative exclusion and positive exclusion, especially when you're trying to understand, is a company involved in energy or oil and gas or these sort of different sin places. As you start to have more real-time data, you can do more things. So you can do things like create ESG indexes or ETFs. You're able to use this as part of the portfolio management process to be able to, as an example, understand the risk embedded in your portfolio, along with the ongoing monitoring of different controversies that might impact you. We've seen this being used in the compliance process, where people are doing things like vendor due diligence or supply due diligence. Some of you might be getting this directly from the companies or from your clients as well. And then we've also seen really good use cases for PR and communications. So they're able to sort of keep on tab of what others are doing from a sustainability perspective or an ESG perspective, and use that to benchmark themselves and make different decisions. And so in closing, I just want to say thank you for attending this webinar. We will answer any questions shortly after this. And we also want to give a shout out to our sponsor, Extract Alpha. For those of you who don't know who they are, check them out at extractalpha.com. They're a very interesting provider of quant-based data, where they look at all different alternative data sets and actually distill the ones that are more alpha related. They do the work to benchmark these, to understand them, and then actually create signals that are used to trade in. So in that sense, they really understand what the best data is out there. So thanks to them for sponsoring this, and I will pass it back to you, Mattia.
Thank you, Q. That was definitely informative and engaging presentation and great insights. So now we'll take a few minutes to answer your questions. So please use the questions function and submit your questions. We have some questions already. So if you have any questions, feel free to ask them now. So the ones that we received, let's start with the one. How do you know which sources to trust for the news?
It's a good question. I think there's different ways that we look at this. So one, we try to get as broad a mix as possible, which is why we don't just look at alternative, like things like Reuters and Bloomberg. We also extend that to things like opinions and social media. But I would say that there is different approaches that you can take to actually understand what the trust quality is of that specific source, and use that as an input into the analysis.
Thanks, Q. So another question, how do you explain models like neural networks who are black box?
That's a great question. And I can see why people would ask that, because it is a bit scary to think of a world of neural networks and what they're actually doing, right? So we've built a few of these ourselves. And the thing is, like, when you take a neural network, you're given it, the key thing is feature engineering, right? So if we're looking at specific types of features that are an input to a model, like let's say for a company, we want to predict stock prices, we might be looking at things that we think are features, right? Where is the company located, what their stock price is, what kind of company they are, what's their PE ratio, et cetera, et cetera. When you put this into a neural network, what's going to happen is that the computer is going to develop its own features and use that to predict an outcome, because you're going to give all the data to say, hey, we know that these companies had this result, and it's going to optimize for those. So it might see things that we don't, which can be a little bit scary, but it can also be quite powerful, depending on the right context, right? So maybe stock price prediction, a little bit less scary. Making decisions for people's healthcare, maybe you run into different ethical concerns based on where they are.
Thanks, Q. So here is another question. Could you please talk again about how you assign weight to different signals to come up with the overall ESG pulse?
That's also a really good question. Thanks for that. So the question is, assign in weights. We think about this a little bit differently. What we like to say is that everyone's use case is a little bit more specific. So when you look at the ESG pulse that I've shown you today, that is almost more of a volume-weighted score, because what it's doing is it's taking all of the events that have happened for a company, the ESG events, and then it's gonna basically take the average of all of those. So it's not actually weighted, but inherently it's volume weighted by the number of articles that might have happened for something specific. The reason we do that is because we find that every company's relationship with ESG is quite different. So, but what we enable is for people to take this and do it and use it in a way that they choose to. So that's just the default. You could go in and you could weight things by E, S, and G, or by, as an example, you might want to use the SASB materiality map to say, because as an example, something like technology companies versus materials companies, they have different things that are more material than others. So SASB has that model, you could use that. But we've also released a new score called the ESG Beta that shows this relationship, right? And so even in the car manufacturing companies, something like Tesla, wildly different ESG relationships in terms of controversies and sentiment compared to something like Ford or Peugeot, right? And so that's where we find that volume weighted is a really good place to start, and then you can customize it, especially if your clients only care about, you know, environmental, or if you only care about governance or things like that. You can really tailor it and mix and match. We have a lot of questions, which is really good.
Yeah, there are. Here's I think the easy one. How frequently can you update the company's score?
Also a good question. So we update our scores daily. So basically at midnight UTC every day, we run the news from the previous day, and that comes in. It's also possible to get this to real time as well. We find ESG events tend to be slightly slower moving, so daily is as good as real time. But basically, yeah, you can do anything from there to minute by minute.
Thanks, Hugh. So here's a question. Can we get a demo on request and partnership association with ESG reporting solution? Maybe I can answer that one. Yes, and for all of the registrants of this webinar, we'll have some special offer to provide. And then there are some other questions. So how would you get the general public to get more exposed and engaged to the topic of ESG?
Honestly, it depends on the way that you think about this. I think if you're just talking about sustainability and ESG awareness, I mean, my general take is that you got to make sustainability and this kind of stuff the obvious and the only choice, because people are always going to ask what's in it for them. But I would say that in the context that we're talking about, applying AI for ESG, using ESG data to create scores for companies, it's actually kind of flipped around, because it's people and their sentiment that is driving the notion of ESG, and it's driving why we're even thinking about this in the first place, right? New generations are thinking about it differently. People's attitudes towards climate change, towards diversity and inclusion. These are the attitudes that have actually brought ESG into the forefront, not the way around. So us trying to do this is trying to meet the public perception, whether they call it ESG or not. We are actually here to meet that demand, and that perception has been proven to link companies to doing better if they're using that as a base.
Thanks. So I guess we have a room for a couple of more questions. So here is one about the frequency. So how daily frequency update match with different time zones of the world time?
Yeah, so like I mentioned, we do this at midnight UTC. So that will basically capture all the data from the previous evening. Most of this is so it's if you do need to trade this on US stock market hours, that you can. But every day that we do that, it basically collects that, right? So UTC is a good place to start to do it for the whole world. But at some point during the 24-hour period, we've captured it for all of the companies together. And our coverage is global, so we cover about 16,000 companies, and you know, we can cover as many as we'd like. But at some point, you gotta choose a time to actually do that collection.
Got it. Thanks. So maybe two more. So here's one interesting question. how does this analysis can be used for companies or for investors?
Yeah, I mean, I think we went through some good use cases right at the end there. Lots of different use cases. The primary ones I like to say are due diligence and ongoing monitoring. So typically when it comes to, like, let's say screening a portfolio, that's kind of where you might actually use this data as part of like your evaluation criteria. So I'll show you just a quick example that I didn't show earlier. But this would be an example of the ESG pulse, just the top level pulse, not the individual scores, applied to something like the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which is 30 companies. You would actually be able to, based on your own screening criteria, filter for any sort of financial metrics that you might be looking at, PE ratios, book values, et cetera, and then you could use the ESG pulse as a secondary filter to say, okay, now that I have my basis, let's now filter out companies that aren't really performing from an ESG perspective. Obviously, the fact being that these might have lower quality associated with them or more embedded risk. So, if you're looking at the investment process, it really comes into the first stage, which is your selection of companies. Once you've selected your companies, it's about ongoing monitoring. And the key thing is trying to avoid controversy risk. Because in this world, you don't really get rewarded for doing so good. That's kind of table stakes. Like, why aren't you being a good company? But the second you do some bad things, as we've seen with controversies like Activision Blizzard or some Boeing ones that we were showing, you do get punished for that. So for your portfolio, you're trying to avoid these embedded risks on companies especially with companies that are more sensitive to ESG, because of course that's going to lead to lower returns.
Thanks, Q. So here's one two-part question. I think it will be interesting to answer for all of the participants. Have you ever dropped data sources from the screening? And what is the process to validate the new data sources to be added to the model?
Yeah, so what we do is we keep a blacklist of different data sources. So it's not very frequently that they're added into there, but they might be added for two things. One just might be the data quality is not that good, but the other ones might be that they're shown to be, data sources that are not so good, or fake news or things like that. So the validation process comes from understanding the quality of each one, but then also embedded, because it's a volume weighted score to start with. What we do is typically things that are one-offs, they get weighted less, right? Because more news sources that are a bit more transparent, that are higher quality, there tends to be more events that are related to that kind of stuff. And so typically we have a clustering algorithm that will look at a specific event. Like, let's say there's a mine blast that happened in Australia, which is a controversy that happened for Rio Tinto. That is usually something that's not going to just be talked about once. It gets talked about quite a bit over this matter of a few days. So we have an algorithm that will actually look for the different data sources and create an event out of that, which sort of eliminates these sort of like one-off, like fake news or these kind of weird articles that might not really be talking about the event in the correct way. And that actually helps to give you a more aggregated score that is quite more accurate when you look at sentiment analysis over 3 or 4 different sources, as opposed to a singular source altogether.
Okay, I think maybe have room for one more question. So have you leveraged any of new ChatGPT capabilities to solve this problem?
I would say that at the moment we are on the 5th generation of our NLP model. So we'd like to think that we solved the problem pretty well. Where we are using ChatGPT currently in testing is to do some good summarization. So where we can then give more contextual insights, such as, hey, here are the industries, here are the scores, here are the different things that we've tagged, and just putting that in a nice semantic way that is really easy to digest and sort of run with. And that's kind of where we're also developing some ChatGPT plugins so that you can actually use our data as part of your ChatGPT sort of process.
Okay, thanks, Q. So I think we can finish here with the questions. So So thank you all for your participation. This concludes our webinar today, and we hope you found it informative and helpful. To learn more about ESG analytics, please visit our website www.esganalytics.io. For any questions, please use the contact page on our website or reach out to us directly on the email provided. Thank you again for attending.
Thanks, everybody.